It's my pleasure to introduce our new series. So we've moved on to a new theme, which is the Tantra, also known as the Vajrayana. And I'm going to introduce it tonight, and then some of the things that I talk about will be picked up in the future talks. So because the Vajrayana, the Tantra, is all about images and symbols, I thought we'd just start with a few pictures. So these are images that are from the traditional Indo-Tibetan tradition that express the Tantra. So we are going to explore those images a little bit more during the talk. But in order to understand the Tantra, or the Vajrayana, I'm going to go right back to the beginning, to the Buddha, to the beginning of Buddhism. So the Buddha was a human being who wanted to do something about suffering. He saw suffering around him. And he explored several paths to help him come to the end of his own suffering and to help other people to stop suffering as well. And in the end, he had a very profound, completely transformative experience underneath the Bodhi tree, and in which he understood, he saw what are the causes of suffering and what we can do to overcome it ourselves, in ourselves. So sitting in meditation under the Bodhi tree, he saw the nature of reality, how the unenlightened mind perceives the world wrongly through the lenses of our greed, our hatred, and our ignorance about how things work. And that this causes us suffering, and it also, through it, we cause other people suffering as well, other beings suffering. And if you remember your introductory course, you'll remember that the Buddha saw clearly that everything is changing all the time, nothing is permanent. He saw that all life is deeply interconnected. Everything is deeply interconnected. And he saw that happiness comes from within, not from outer objects or experiences. And having seen this and much else more than that, he then tried to find ways of communicating it to others. And it wasn't easy for him to communicate it because his experience went beyond words, beyond concepts, beyond what language can communicate. Because language splits the world up into separate ideals and concepts, but the Enlightenment experience by its very nature is uncommunicable using words directly. I think his very presence, though, communicated quite a great deal. So his kindness, his compassion for the suffering of all beings, his wisdom, the way he lived his life. So he lived a life as a homeless wanderer. He was a wild man of the jungle. He wore rags. He only ate the food he'd been given, which is quite a thing, isn't it? To think that every day you'd go out with a begging bowl and you'd only eat what you were given. And you know, he could have been he was very respected, very powerful. I'm sure he could have lived a very comfortable life if he'd wanted to. So during his wanderings, his homeless wanderings, he gave lots of teachings to lots of different people. And he gave people meditation practices. He gave people the idea that living ethically would help them, that studying the Dharma, that forming friendships, that this would all help people to awaken, to also experience the awakening that he'd had, the way that he'd seen reality as it is. And many people at the time did experience that awakening and did share that experience. However, after he died, his followers had to then rely just on his teachings. They didn't have his physical presence anymore. He left a huge tradition of many teachings, and they were eventually written down a few hundred years after he died. And they gave rise to the first kind of wave of Buddhism, which is called the Hinayana. So that's on this flip chart here. Hinayana means the sort of lower path, so it's a lesser path, so it's a little bit of a kind of derogatory thing to say. So that kind of group of teachings is also known as the Theravadan, but it was the Hinayana. And I suppose what happened was, that's the teachings that we find in the Pali Canon. And what happened was, over the years, various institutions developed, monks and nuns were supported by lay people, started to perhaps live quite a comfortable life, eating well, and spent quite a lot of time analysing the teachings, classifying them, and making them an academic study. So it became less, for some people, it became less about actually practicing the teachings and more about kind of academically understanding the teachings. So things became quite rule-bound. You know, there were lots of rules that had been developed to help the Sangha live together, but they became a little bit taken as you have to live like that. You know, they were taken very literally. Things were taken literally, they became ossified. Very comfortable, very respectable. So and I'm generalizing like mad, as I'm talking about all these different kind of things, I'm generalizing like mad, but that's the kind of generally what happened. So after several hundred years, there was another sort of revolution in thought, which is called the Mahayana, the Great Way. And the Mahayana developed the Bodhisattva Ideal, which we've been looking at in the last series on the Bodhicharyavatara. And that's such a wonderful, inspiring ideal. But it is still one that you could take, that after a while became perhaps a bit abstract. It became something that you might not be able to do in this lifetime. It became something that other people would do, not something that you could actually practice in your own life. Something so exalted that a person like me could never do it. It became the Mahayana, to some extent, became a matter of talking about abstract ideas rather than actually having an actual transformative practice in daily life. So it's about, people will talk about ideas rather than actually looking at that really unglamorous work of looking what's really going on in our minds and our hearts and changing those deep habit energies we have. So it became about worshipping sacred divine beings from a vast distance without actually trying to bring sacredness into the way we behave, without trying to live more like sacred deities ourselves. So this second wave of Buddhism that became dominant throughout much of the Buddhist world, the Mahayana became very popular. And Mahayana sutras are often these marvelous, cosmic, visionary masterpieces that really express the most exalted spiritual ideals. But what they don't necessarily do is tell you how to actually do things in your own life. How do you express that amazing view, that worldview, in your own life on a day-to-day basis? It's possible to get quite lost in the grandeur of the Mahayana vision and forget that what really matters is starting where we really are and dealing with all the mud and the muck that clogs up our own minds and our hearts. And it seems that the style of Buddhism that we call Tantric or Vajrayana, Tantra and Vajrayana can just be used as the same thing to describe the same thing. So this kind of Buddhism seems to have evolved as a way of getting back to the real experience and getting out of the world of abstractions and back to what's real. And it seems to have arisen from outside the respectable world of the monasteries, among small groups of practitioners who had a shared approach centered around a guru. And it seems to have grown from a practice in both Buddhism and Hinduism that comes out of a shamanic, magical approach to the spiritual life. So an approach that would use magic as a way of invoking and focusing strong energies and strong emotions to achieve worldly ends. So you might use magic to destroy an enemy. You might use magic to make someone fall in love with you. And Tantra is a kind of extension of this, in which magical practices are used to invoke strong energies for the achievement of spiritual aims. So, for instance, we might use a strong energy to destroy the obstacles to our progress, or to make ourselves fall in love with enlightenment. So it's using those magical energies for spiritual ends. So the Vajrayana developed out of this sort of magical tradition, and that's a kind of interesting place to start, both a strength and a weakness. It's a strength because it freed Buddhism from abstraction and from the kind of respectability that had started to happen. But it was a weakness because also the Dharma got very mixed up with superstition, with folk belief, and perhaps lost contact sometimes with the aims of the Dharma and degenerated into folk magic, into black magic even. So, interesting, that's kind of interesting, but what relevance does it have for us? Yes, so it's interesting that when Sangharakshita, who founded the Triratna Buddhist movement, when he first came back to the UK in the 1960s, there was already an existing Buddhist society that was exploring Buddhism. And people in the Buddhist society kept telling him that we must make Buddhism respectable. Because I suppose because it came from the East, there was a strong sense we need to make this very respectable and so it'll appeal to the middle classes. And that's what people thought was the right thing to do. But Sangharakshita's response to that this is the last thing we should be trying to do. He felt we should really get back to the scary, exhilarating, challenging radicalism of the true Dharma, which is in many ways completely opposed to the worldly views that are respectable in our society. So he said a few things that people found quite controversial. He said that instead of making Buddhism respectable, he said things to people like, if you're just working for money, if that's the only reason you're working so that you have money, just say to hell with financial security and all those other mind-forged manacles that keep you trapped in a dull, boring life, stop you from living a meaningful life. Stop being brainwashed by the advertising industry and the politicians, the big money interests. Do as little paid work as possible. Do as little work as you can get away with. Get off the treadmill and then join with others in creating a completely new kind of society that's based on dharmic values. So I think that Sangharakshita saw that a respectable Buddhism becomes a safe, lukewarm Buddhism. And a little bit of lukewarm, safe, spiritual practice probably isn't going to bring about much personal transformation. Because changing ingrained habits, seeing the reality that the Buddha saw when he sat under the Bodhi tree, it's not easy to do that. And to really change at a deep level, we need intensity. So Buddhism needs to keep reinventing itself, getting back to the original spirit. So I think, most religions go through this thing where there's some kind of inspirational, quite wild founder, like Jesus Christ, for instance, found something, a particular way of living, and then over the years it becomes very respectable, it becomes very safe, it becomes something that people just do one day of the week, they don't do every day of their lives. And then you have to kind of blow it all open again and start again, go back to the principles of what's going on. And what we're going to do in this series of talks over the next few months is we're going to be exploring Tantric or Vajrayana Buddhism, which is one of the ways that Buddhism got closer to the spirit of the Buddha's original teaching when the mainstream had maybe lost contact with it a bit. So Tantra means woven, which is interesting because you'll probably heard of Pali sutras or Mahayana sutras, and sutta means thread. And I think it's interesting that Tantra actually means more woven together. There's something in that, yeah. And we use the word Vajrayana or Tantra synonymously. So Vajrayana is the way of the Vajra. So there's some pictures of the Vajra, I hope. Yeah, Vajra. So you probably all come across a Vajra, the diamond thunderbolt that cuts through to what's real, cuts through obstacles. And I've put a few Vajras down at the front, so if you want to come up after the talk and just hold a Vajra and have a closer look at one if you haven't before, please do. I find there's something about holding a Vajra, it has a particular sort of power or something in the weight of it. So this is a very strong image, and so it's diamond. Of itself, it won't get damaged, and it can cut through anything that it comes across, like a thunderbolt. You can imagine, I think from, Norwegian mythology, the idea of Thor with the thunderbolt that kind of comes down from the sky. And if you think of thunder, what it's like, or lightning, what it's like, the energy that's there, and actually it's quite scary as well, can be quite destructive. So this is using that kind of energy for positive purposes. And so the Vajrayana is the way of the Vajra, the way of the diamond thunderbolt. And the Tantra is about going beyond words to our direct experience, going to an experience that we can evoke, we can conjure up, we can glimpse with the help of symbols, images, mantras, and rituals. And there's a lot of very inspiring stuff in the Tantra, I hope you'll find, over the next few weeks. But I don't think we can just copy these traditional forms of Tantra that have come down to us, because they've come from the medieval Tibetans, Indians, Japanese. It's like they've come from people who live very different lives from us. So what we need to do is we need to look at the Tantra and pull out from it what's useful to us and sort of reinvent it. And you could say that we in Triratna are engaged in forging a Western Tantra. So we're looking at a style of Buddhism that cuts through all those incrustations of several thousand years of tradition in lots of different cultures. And we're looking, to get rid of all the abstractions, get back to a real-life Buddhism that really transforms people. And that's what we're looking at how can we translate the original Tantra and Vajrayana so that we get the same transformative cutting edge for ourselves in our lives. So to do that, we need to stand back, we need to look at the principles. It's a huge area of the Tantra, so if you get caught up in all the details, Sangharakshita says it's like being caught in the jungle, and there's so much of it. So what we're going to do is just look at a few principles. And there's a teacher in the Triratna tradition called Visantra, who has, in his book, which is really worth looking at actually, which is about tantric figures in Tibetan Buddhism, he has drawn out 7 main characteristics of the Tantra. And Vedanya's shortened those to 5, so I'm using those 5. I should have shortened it again, shouldn't I? But anyway, we've got 5. Okay, so the first principle behind Tantra is that it works with symbols and magic. It grew out of a magical shamanic tradition, and it uses practices that are like magical practices to gain spiritual ends. Tantric practice involved a lot of ritual, invoking powerful archetypal figures. It involved stepping into the world of myth and living out a mythic version of reality in our daily life. And we're going to have several talks on this aspect, looking at how we can use ritual, symbol, myth, archetypal figures in our practice, so that we can bring all of our being, the conscious and the subconscious sides of ourselves, into our practice. So the second is that Tantra is concerned with energy. So sometimes in the spiritual life, it can seem like there's a conflict between being good, being a really good Buddhist, and having energy. Because a lot of our energy seems to come from the lower, coarser drives that seem to have more to do with the animal realm than they do with the spiritual realm. But it does take a lot of energy to change, and we need to be beings who are full of energy, brimming over and overflowing with energy. Being enlightened doesn't mean being flat and stagnant and boring. It means having just so much energy that it just pours out of you. So we can't afford to cut off from those lower sources of energy, even if they don't seem very Buddhist. We need to transform our lower energies so they can help us. And the third principle that Visantra talks about is one of the ways that we do that. So Tantra makes use of the strongest experiences of life. So Tantra makes use of the strongest experiences that we happen in our lives. So we know that when strong experiences happen to us, they bring up huge amounts of energy. When somebody falls in love, they often find a whole load of energy to travel and visit the person that they've fallen for, to write them really long letters or emails. It's amazing how much energy somebody can find if they fall in love with somebody. If we really want something, we can put a lot of energy into it. If we really want a job, we can put a lot of energy into getting that job. If we're angry, we can be really full of energy. I find it, how energized I get when I'm angry is quite amazing. Or if we're afraid, sometimes that can give us energy as well. And actually, compared to the energy in those things I was talking about, those things that are very powerful in our lives, the way we normally pursue our spiritual life is a bit half-hearted. So if we could redirect that kind of energy that gets stirred up by the big experiences of life, by, falling in love, being angry, and we could use it to propel us towards enlightenment, we'd get there a lot quicker. So the Vajrayana sets out to use these energies. And one way that our approach in Triratna could be called Vajrayana is our approach to pleasure. So a lot of our energy is tied up in the search for pleasure. And a figure that you've probably come across is Padma Sam Bhava, who we could say a great deal about. Probably quite a few of you were here when we had Padma Sam Bhava Day not long ago. So Padma Sam Bhava, a figure who's very much associated with transformation. And one of the things that he says is, I do not give up pleasure, I take it with me on the path. So there's something about we take our completely natural desire for pleasure and bring it onto our spiritual path. And what we need to do, therefore, is redirect our search for pleasure so that we get our pleasure from the things that really make us happy and fulfilled. So we raise the level of our being. So we can actually actively set out to refine ourselves, I suppose, and teach ourselves to get pleasure from things that are higher, perhaps, than things we just naturally would get pleasure from. So, for instance, with music, you might decide to teach yourself to really understand classical music so that you can really engage with that and get pleasure from that. So So as well as pleasure, a lot of our energy is tied up in deep drives like aggression and fear. And we can even harness those to our spiritual life. So that's why in the Tantra there are some quite weird figures, like Vajrapani, this figure here. So Vajrapani, a wrathful deity, a wrathful figure, perhaps representing the way that we can redirect our energy, our anger and aggression towards the spiritual life. So we can have anger at what gets in the way. We can have anger at our own blockages, and that energy can burst through obstacles. We also get quite a lot of imagery in the Tantra to do with death. So these are, that's a mala made of bone, and that's a skull used in different rituals. Usually, or I think often, tantric practitioners will use bones, skulls, as part of their practice. Because it reminds us of death, and death really motivates us. It's a very scary thing for most of us. And it also reminds us of impermanence, that we don't have forever to practice. So bringing in things that we associate with death, with fear, they can really motivate us to practice. And also, images that are to do with aggression. So there's a demon dagger there and a cutter. So a demon dagger, what you do is you find the demons that are getting in your way, you use the dagger to pin them down, and then you can have a conversation with them. So it's a way of identifying your demons and getting to know them better if they keep running away from you. And the cutter can cut through the obstacles as well. So these images that are of what you might think of as weapons can be used in our practice. Yeah, okay, so we've looked at Tantra using transforming energy. Now, something that's really important in the Tantra is it starts at the highest point. So what that means is that Vajrayana practices often ask us to pretend that we're enlightened now, to act as if we're enlightened, rather than waiting for some future time. Because generally the way we practice, of course, is we use the law of karma to gradually work towards becoming enlightened sometime in the future, way off. Whereas this is about, well, just use your imagination to think, what would it be like if I was enlightened now? How would I behave? So we already do that in some ways. For instance, if you act in accordance with the precepts, you might not want to act in accordance with the precepts, but you see that they reflect the way that that an enlightened mind would see the world, and so you follow the precepts anyway. So there's a kind of magical power, I think, in thinking, what would it be like if I was enlightened? And an interesting story that Vidania will tell more next week, which is the story of Merlin. So Merlin, the wizard, the magician, who lives backwards. So he knows what's going to happen already, so he starts old and gets younger. So he lives his life backwards. And a lot of us, particularly when I notice this in myself a lot, is I spend quite a lot of my life thinking about all the conditions that have caused me to be like I am today. And often, quite a lot of time, just really reflecting on unhelpful conditions that have led to me behave like I am today. Whereas this is a completely different approach, which is you look forward and you imagine the great person you might be in the future, and you put your mind to that, and that's where you look. So you look forward rather than back. We're going to comment on a little bit more about that later. So Tantra is also concerned with direct experience. So Tantra is concerned with direct experience. So that's the last of the principles of Tantra we're going to look at. So what that means is it's not ideas about what's happening or what we should be or what someone else should be. It's what is actually going on, our actual experience. And the traditional Tantra would sometimes do this by taking quite abstract spiritual ideas and make them much more direct and graphic and colourful and rooted in our experience, and perhaps even dangerous and sensationalist, anything to kind of get your attention. So one way it does this is it embodies abstract ideas in everyday reality. So for instance, all Buddhists of whatever tradition revere the three refuges, as they're called, so the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And, before we meditate, when we come up after the tea break, we pay our respects to the 3 jewels, and we say Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya. And what we're doing there is we're saying, I pay my respects, I pay homage to the Buddha, to the principle of enlightenment within me, to the Dharma, and to the Sangha. The Sangha is the community of practitioners. But what does it actually mean to go for refuge? That's an expression of going for refuge. What does it mean to actually go for refuge? How do they manifest in our actual experience? So, for instance, the Buddha, if we're going to we pay our respect to the Buddha, we go for refuge to the Buddha, well, he's been dead for 2,500 years. So it's difficult for him perhaps to be a fact in our actual direct experience. And the Dharma, as you will know, is huge. Just the Pali Canon itself takes a whole shelf in our library. If you go and look at the shelves in the library downstairs, you'll see the Dharma is huge. There's lots of different schools taking different approaches who are aimed at different levels, different temperaments. So it can be a bit like, well, how can we center our lives on something that's so vague and big as the whole of the Dharma? Thirdly, there's the Sangha. So traditionally, the Sangha is divided into the Arya Sangha, which is the noble Sangha, and that's the Sangha of enlightened beings and Bodhisattvas. So that is the Sangha that we would go for refuge to, the Arya Sangha, not the kind of unenlightened Sangha that we presumably are here. So it would be difficult in a way, perhaps, to have much of a connection with this kind of exalted Arya Sangha, these spiritual beings. And I don't know how we would know as well, perhaps, if we did have a connection with those beings. So it's interesting to look at now how the Tantra managed to make those things more live for people and how we might do that now, because the two things aren't necessarily the same. So in terms of the Buddha, in traditional Tantra, we see what would happen is we would see our guru, our teacher, as the Buddha. And we would teach ourselves to absolutely see our guru as the Buddha and to kind of not turn a blind eye to anything that didn't fit into that idea that our teacher might be a Buddha, but to see them as an enlightened being. And the reason for that is because it would mean that we would then really, really connect with them. We would be open to them being a Buddha, and that would mean that we would grow. But that doesn't work so much for us. Firstly, we don't tend to think in True Ratna of having a guru in that traditional sense. It's proved to be quite a dangerous idea in the West for both people who are gurus and for their followers as well. So we don't tend to do that. So I wonder what we can do in our own experience to really bring the Buddha alive. How does the Buddha really manifest in our own experience? So the first thing we can do, which is similar, is we can, we do have people who we might recognize who are more enlightened than we are, or further along the path than we are. People who seem to be kinder, more aware, have more energy in a particular way than us. And we don't need to think of them as Buddhas, but we can aspire to develop the qualities that we see in them, to take them as an example, to take their advice seriously, to use them as guides. So it's a bit like we can look for the Buddha in those people whilst knowing fully well that they're not Buddhas. That's one thing we can do. Another is we connect with the Buddha in our imagination. So in a way, imagination is actually a sense-direct experience if it's vivid. If we imagine something, if we bring it to mind, however we do that, whether it's visual or whether it's imagining being with somebody, we can have a really strong sense of somebody. So we also might have fictional experiences in our imagination, books we've read, people we've read about, figures, fictional figures, films we've seen. And we can bring them to mind, the Buddha acting, how the Buddha seems to be acting in those people. We can imagine after ourselves, who is the most amazing person I can imagine? How magnificent might they be? And again, we could imagine ourselves as being magnificent as well, not concentrating on what we're failing at, but concentrating on what we might be able to be amazing at. So that's one way to connect with the idea of the Buddha, is through our imagination. Another is through our experience of beauty. So we will all have that experience of our heart lifting when we come across beauty. So you might see it in the sky, you might see it in the sea, the mountains, the sunset. It might happen in a piece of music, a work of art, something that seems to kind of refer to something that's bigger than itself. And we can allow that heart opening to lead us to something bigger, to beauty. And that is what the Buddha's like. So that kind of sense of our heart opening, when we allow that, and sometimes we might not pay much attention to it actually, but we can actually take up a practice of allowing ourselves to really be open to our heart opening with beauty. I went to Snowdonia this weekend, and there's just this extraordinarily austere, huge, I think granite, I'm not sure, granite cliffs called the Devil's Kitchen, with this pool of water below that was just so kind of austerely beautiful that it just really lifted me up. There was something very amazing about it. Or I remember visiting the Sagrada Familia, the cathedral in Barcelona that's still being built, just about. And if you go in there, there's stained glass windows that the light comes through. There's a sense of height, and there's something really beautiful there that just really wakes you up. So there'll be things that you've experienced like that, and there's something about really allowing ourselves to enjoy those, So that's how we might connect with the Buddha, with our imagination, with our experience of beauty, with our experience. So what about the Dharma? How do we connect with all this huge amount of Dharma that is available to us? So traditionally what they do in the Tantric experience is that they would make, they'd see what's called the Yidam, which is a figure that you meditate on, an enlightened figure that you meditate on. And they would see that figure as expressing the Dharma. And in Triratna, when we're ordained, we take on a figure usually to meditate on. And at first I was a bit confused about how this would work in terms of it being the Dharma. But I think there's something about what the Dharma really is, the teachings of the Buddha, is it's not just kind of lots of ideas about things, it's the actual experience of compassion or of wisdom or of energy. And by meditating on a figure every day, you get much more of an experience of that compassion. The figure that I meditate on is about light and love. I get more of that experience than if I was to kind of read a little, some sentences about it. So that's why in the original Tantra they would use the figure, the Yidam, to meditate on and see the Yidam as being an expression of the Dharma. But for us that might not work. So perhaps what we can think of is that what we need to do is focus on a little bit of the Dharma, just a tiny bit of the Dharma that we're practicing right now. So if we're mitras, it might be something in mitra study. It might be a precept that we want to act more and more. So for instance, we might take on that we want to be more mindful. And we might think, well, let's really bring our imagination to it. Because actually being mindful can feel sound maybe like it might be a bit boring. A bit kind of like, I don't know, you sit doing nothing, just kind of like watching the world or something. But we could think of mindfulness perhaps as being, if we were like a ninja or a samurai, what would it be like to go around the whole day being mindful in a way where we're completely alert and relaxed and aware of what's going on within us and aware of what's going on with other people and outside of us. So we can use our imagination there to really connect with something like mindfulness in a different way. You might also choose to have a short, pithy bit of Dharma that you just carry around with you, that you might learn off by heart. And a couple of series ago, you'll remember we did the 7-point mind training series. And for people who were able to come, Arya Dasa made these lovely little cards with slogans on that I still see people have actually. Like I noticed the other day someone still got one on the back of her phone. So those slogans were great because you could really remember those, memorize them and then practice them throughout your life. So for instance, one slogan was, be grateful to everyone. So that was just saying, whoever I meet, however difficult they are a practice, I can be grateful to them because it's a practice for me, a time for me to practice metta. Another line would be something like, always be the first to smile. So you might take that as your practice for the week. So just having a little bit of Dharma that we practice and we really make part of our lives might be the kind of modern tantric way of approaching going for refuge to the Dharma. So the third is the Sangha jewel that we go for refuge to. So how did they, at the time of the Tantra, how did they express that? Like this. Okay, so this is Vajrayana. Vajrayana is a Darkini. She is a naked female sky dancer. So in modern Indian languages, she's a female flesh-eating demoness. You can see that she is trampling on somebody. She's got a whole load of skulls and heads around her neck. This is another version of her. In this one, she's trampling on a couple more people, and she's pouring it's like she's drinking blood from a skull cup. So she's a very strong image. So how does that represent the Sangha? So Sangharakshita interprets it that what she's expressing, what the sky dancer, what Vajrayana is expressing, is liberated, blissful energy that comes from being naked, from being open, from being without pretenses. So Sangha, spiritual friendship, is a context in which we can start to open up with each other. We can let down our defenses. We can become, as it were, naked. We can feel that it's okay to show all of ourselves to each other. So we can really be ourselves. We can really develop deep communication with other people without all the masks and the usual kind of layers and layers and layers and layers of clothing that we normally have. And this openness, this nakedness, releases a lot of energy, a lot of bliss. It energizes us and it brings joy. So maybe that's partly why the Dakini was the image to represent the Sangha. For us, maybe Vajrayana works really, or the Dakini works really well for you, that's great. Another way we can see the Sangha as going for refuge to the Sangha in a very kind of real way is, well, how we work together, actually. So here we are, we're a real Buddhist community. We've all got flaws. But if we're going to get anywhere with our practice, we need to be able to get on with each other, to forgive each other our flaws, to work on our own faults that cut ourselves off from other people, to develop friendships, to learn to be more open, and to let myself be myself. Something about seeing ourselves as engaged in a common project, which is and I can let go of my individualism and join in. So this can be the Sangha jewel for us. This can be the kind of modern tantric way that we actually, in a very real way, practice Sangha with each other. So we've looked at these three refuges, the Buddha, the Dharma, the Sangha, and that's just one way that we might be able to bring abstract ideas down to earth and make them part of our every real, concrete, everyday experience. And we're going to come across lots of other examples as we go through the series. It runs right through the tantric approach. So I'm just going to finish nearly today by coming back to look at one of Tantra's characteristics, which is that one that Tantra begins at the highest point. So that's where we act as if we are already enlightened. So we get up each day and we manifest as much enlightenment as we can, be what we can. Why wait, in a way? Why wait? Because the world needs more enlightenment. The world needs more kindness, openness, energy, awareness. So why not just act as if we already have that? So we can think of ourselves as becoming a Vajra, that diamond that cuts through the old habits, the old patterns, the deadening routine, and the Vajra that faces each moment, moment by moment, cutting through to what's really going on. So we can be the Dharma, and we can manifest as much of the awakened state as we can imagine. And we can think of ourselves as being like a warrior in battle. So really bringing our awareness to defending ourselves against all those kind of deadening, seductive, cozy pool of old patterns. Because what humans want to do is we want to be comfortable. We don't want to face up to reality, which is not comfortable. Interestingly, that all these Buddhist movements have in a way become more comfortable over the years, and then they need to be blown apart. And that's what we need to do with ourselves. We need to look to see when our Buddhist practice might mean we're actually just settling down, and can we blow that apart again? Can we really make each moment an opportunity to practice? So the Buddha said we should face each moment like someone whose turban is on fire. So like someone whose turban is on fire. And where does the fire come from? Well, it's caused by these old, boring ways of being. So what we need to do is, in order to put out the fire, is to really manifest as much of this kind of upliftedness as energy, clarity, truth, metta as we can muster, and to act as if we were the enlightened being we will become, bringing this into the present. So one very simple way to do that is to think to ourselves, well, what would the Buddha do now? Or what would Padma Sam Bhava do in this situation? What would Vajra Yogini do? What would Tara, the very beautiful Rupa of Tara on the shrine at the moment, what would Tara do in this situation? So can I see myself? Can I see through the Buddha's eyes? If I've got a really difficult meeting at work, what would it be like to approach that with the kindness of the Buddha, or the energy of Padma Sam Bhava, or the energy of Vajra Yogini? So I can think of myself as being enlightened. I can also see other people as being enlightened. So what would it be like to go into that difficult meeting and think, actually, all these people here are enlightened. It's just they're kind of helping me out by being a bit annoying today. So go into that situation seeing other beings as being enlightened as well. And you could plan, you could look ahead. And I think there's something very magical that can come to our experience if we bring this awareness of the magical possibility of every moment, of that we could look at the world as if we are enlightened. And just a little example actually is, like a little golden leaf has come here, which is great, because today I was just walking along and I was really caught up in my own thoughts, and suddenly I noticed that the floor was golden. You know, there were just these beautiful leaves that had fallen everywhere, and they were absolutely, when I paid attention to them, they were completely beautiful and magical and wonderful, but I'd been so full of my own kind of concerns up in my head that I hadn't seen them at first. So there's something about that we can bring an awareness to the world where we see it as a much more magical and beautiful place. If we live from what is highest in us. So I'm just going to end with a short quote from William Blake, because maybe part of finding the Tantra, the Vajrayana, in now is that we use the inspiration of our own culture. So it's a verse that I'm sure you'll know. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. I'm going to read it again, actually. To see a world in a grain of sand and a heaven in a wild flower, hold infinity in the palm of your hand and eternity in an hour. Okay. Okay, so we're going to go into groups, which is what we normally do now. Yeah, for people here for the first time, the structure is that after the talk, we're going to groups, then we have a tea break, and then we come back here and do some meditation together. So in the groups, there's a couple of things I thought we could talk about. So the first is, how can we ourselves get more of this kind of intensity in our practice? How can we make our practice more direct, more emotionally charged? So I'll just say that again. How can we get more intensity in our practice? How can we make our practice more direct, more emotionally charged? And is there something coming up this week, a situation, where you think it might help if you were to act as if you were enlightened, to act if you were the Buddha or Vajra Yogini? I think if acting as Vajra Yogini, that would be quite a thing. Anyway, is there a situation where that would help you this week? And can you apply it? And also maybe in that same situation, would it help to think of the others involved in it as being enlightened as well? Okay, so in groups, what would be great is if anybody who's come from Union Street or was involved with that course at all want to go down to the blue room. Okay, and people who don't know where the blue room is, I think Pretty will show you. Yeah, thank you. And then we could have the men's group are going to meet in the green room this time. So change there. It's Vajra Yogini. Okay. And then the mixed group will meet in the red shrine room to start off with. And anyone who'd like to be in a women's group can stay up here.